The session is election planning, crafting coverage that educates and legitimizes, and we're going to share research-backed tips for covering elections in ways that restore trust in the process and address concerns from skeptical audiences. And we'll have two speakers. The first is Gina Masullo. She's an associate professor here in the School of Journalism and Media, and she's also the associate director of the Center for Media Engagement. She came to the Academy after 20 years as a newspaper reporter in upstate New York, with most of her career at the Post-Standard in Syracuse. She's the author of books including Online Civility and Public Debate, Nasty Talk, and The New Town Hall, Why We Engage Personally with Politicians, as well as the co-editor of Scandal in the Digital Age. And she's part of our Knight research team that's studying how to bridge divides between disparate groups in society, including media and the public. And she will be joined by Caroline Murray. Caroline is a senior research associate at the Center for Media Engagement in the Moody College here at UT. Her research focuses on building trust in the news media and engagement across political divides. And she'll be sharing some of her work that she's done qualitatively examining what people who feel that the election was not legitimate have to say about that and strategies for reaching them. So please join me in welcoming Gina and Caroline.
Thank you, Gina and Caroline. I'm going to serve as the moderator for this session. I do ask everyone to hold your questions till the end. We are going to leave plenty of time for you guys to ask questions and still wrap up and get you guys out of here by 2:30. So we will slide right into it and start with our first question. What research has the Center for Media Engagement done that is relevant to local news coverage of elections?
Yeah, so just broadly, the center's done a lot of work on strategies that journalists can use to boost trust outside of just election coverage, but that does include political coverage. And then personally, I've worked on how journalistic transparency can influence how people view the media. And then most relevant to our discussion today, we did interview 56 people who thought that the election was illegitimate, that it was fraudulent, that Donald Trump was probably at least the legitimate winner of the election. So we'll be talking a little bit more about what they think, the kind of media that they turn to draw that conclusion, and just their thoughts more broadly.
Yeah, and coupled with that, the tips I'm bringing are coming from a bunch of our research. We teamed up with journalists and interviewed conservatives about how they feel about the media, but a lot of what they said really applies to elections. We also surveyed them, but we also surveyed and interviewed Black Americans and Hispanic and Latino Americans, and that informs this as well, because honestly, there was a lot of shared feelings of negative perceptions about the media between those groups, even though they're very, very different groups. And as Caroline mentioned, we've done a lot of continuing studies on trust and transparency and how that shapes attitudes, and that kind of feeds into what we're doing as well.
Can you talk a little bit about the importance of fact-checking at the local level during a national story, such as the national election?
Yeah, so I think on the first level, so when we were talking to people who thought the election was fraudulent, and we were asking them what kinds of news sources that they used, obviously we talked to several people who were very involved in the right-wing space, both online and in news. But something that was surprising to us is that there were a good portion that weren't, that were consuming a diverse set of sources, and that were reading local news or watching local news, and reporting that they felt like that was a better area for them than something like CNN, for example. So on the one hand, there are opportunities there, even if the trust isn't high right now. Like if they're still tuning in, it's not just an unreachable population. The other thing I would say is that when we were asking people, like, what kinds of evidence were they using to conclude that the election was fraudulent, even though that was a presidential election, so it's a national election, they weren't just using national stories or like things that Donald Trump had said or national leaders had said. They were mentioning local rumors that they had heard, and those were kind of influential to what they thought, right? Like they were saying, oh, I heard about a pallet of ballots found at a construction site in my neighborhood, or I know that my neighbor got a ballot for her grandfather who had died. And so really bolstering their idea that this was true based on local rumors. So I think that there is a lot of room there for local fact-checking, local reporting to really help those people out.
Yeah, and what I will add to that is, I know I've talked to many of you and we've had in the public session, there's sort of this, should we fact check, should we not? Does it amplify, does it not amplify? And you also don't want to spend all your time fact checking. I mean, we talked in the last session about, pre-bunking or doing process type stories to get ahead of it, which all seem to resonate with what people were saying. The good news is that even among the conservatives that we surveyed and interviewed, trust in local media is relatively high relative to national media. So that's that's a good story to tell, that they might trust a fact check from y'all more than a fact check from a national organization. So that's good. I mean, it's, the trust is still low, but it's not as bad. So it's a positive trend at least.
What role do visuals play in how people may misinterpret election coverage, and how journalists can address that problem?
Yeah, so one of the things that we asked people who thought the election was fraudulent was what was the first moment, right, where you thought that something could be wrong with the election. And several people would bring up election night, right? So they are watching television news, they're watching a vote count online come in, and they said it was the first moment was when I heard that some states that had been steadily going up for Trump, I'd seen them going up for Trump, shifted to Biden either overnight or in the next few days. One of the things that they would talk about there is it was a very visual thing for them. We were on Zoom sometimes and they would use their hands talking about the graphs, and then boom, there is a sudden influx of votes for Biden that they found very suspicious, that they had never seen before. And I think that while it's very likely that there was some context in local news reporting, especially surrounding that for them, people watch TV news when they're distracted, when the sound is off, right? So it got us thinking what kinds of visual representations of vote counters in particular, how that might play a role in influencing how people interpret those results, right? Oh, sure, yeah.
In Milwaukee, they have what's called a central count, where they count all the absentee ballots. On 2020, tens of thousands of ballots. It was 3 a.m, and the results are on a card, and the head of the elections brings that over to the county clerk. She had a police escort. I captured cell phone video of her coming out of the building, getting in the car, leaving with the police to deliver the results to the county, and that flipped the results in Wisconsin. Trump was ahead, and it, as was expected, gave it to Biden. And that tweet took on a life of its own. People are still retweeting and be oh my God, look at this ballot dump that was captured, that, as if it was some nefarious, but it just exploded across social media. And it was a, 20-second clip.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's a really good example. And I don't know that there is a solution for, I think there's 3 categories of people. We sort of, when we did these interviews and surveys, there's some people who are persuadable, right? And there's some people who, that pre-bunking story, explaining the process in advance, votes are going to flip, and the reason they flip is the absentees get counted later, and that's just that's normal, that's the way it is. There's some people who will get that, right? Some people who have misinformation because they're just confused, right? There's some people you'll never sway, right? And you kind of can't worry about them. Although, to what Carolyn is saying, if you can even post that full clip, but you don't also want it to go viral and do the opposite. And it is a thorny problem, because it's people see something and they don't hear what the journalist is saying or the anchor is saying. So maybe some answer to that is using words on the screen more, but you can't force people, right? You can't force people to pay attention to it. But I can see sometimes that, what we found was people would take away the opposite message that you're actually trying to deliver, right? And that's pretty thorny. The other thing that I wanted to mention about this was, and this was brought up by one of you during our previous session, was the whole horse race type coverage, which, you know, obviously elections are exciting, right? I mean, one of the things I miss the most about being a journalist, to be honest, is covering murder trials and election night. And I'm not sure what that says about me as a human being, but I do. I mean, on election night, I stay up all night, I have 3 computers up, I'm tweeting, because I miss being with you all doing that. Like, it is super fun. And those of you who've never done it, it's really fun. But we know, right, that focus on the who's winning and losing is exciting. It's like watching a ball game, and it's really exciting. But it does feed into it, right? Because then people get concerned that, you know, they get an overemphasis on the race part of it. So, I mean, there's been a long time of criticism of, you know, horse race coverage of politics in general. There's a lot of good reasons why we cover it like a horse race, because horse races are fun. You know, like, that's fun and exciting, and you don't want to make your stories boring, because then nobody wants to read them or watch them. But I do think that I'm glad that came up in the discussion, because I think the more at least you can sort of like think about that and be like, okay, are we fully presenting the fact that this result, when an early result is really meaningless and nothing, you know, maybe we need to get to a time where we don't even say those. I don't think we're at that time, because you don't want to be beat by other people, but that would probably be better for democracy, right? If we didn't even say when those beginning results came in, because it's confusing to people. But I think, you know, what we heard from people in our research was that did confuse them a lot. And so however you can pre-bunk it, as we talked about in the other session, or at least over-explain in the moment, is probably beneficial.
Can you talk about how people may misunderstand journalistic routines, like fact-checking or use of sources?
Yeah, I think it's a pretty consistent theme across a lot of research that we've done, that the layperson doesn't understand what y'all do. They have very little, like, conceptualization of what a journalist's day-to-day is, like how a story comes together, for example. As you can imagine, that was true of the population that we talked to about election fraud. But what was interesting is that they would almost perceive a statement in a news article like there was no widespread evidence or evidence of widespread election fraud. They interpreted that as like there was no work done on this. Like that was just heard from an official somewhere, someplace, and they haven't even looked into it, right? They're ignoring the issue. And I think what really could be helpful there is this kind of like radical transparency. I was talking to some of you about like how many raw hours go into fact checking, right? So when you do present a story, say like, hi, like, you know, we worked X amount of hours on this. We talked to X number of people, and here's like why we did that, why it was important to us. Here are the kinds of documents that we were looking at. We read 1,000 pages this week, right? Like, what was going on with y'all? And I think that could go a long way also for this particular group, because some of the people that we talked to really thought of themselves as investigators, right? Like they thought that this was a little bit fun for them. They were almost trying to take on a journalistic role, obviously not coming to the conclusion that we would like them to. But one man told me that he filed a FOIA request like in the course of his investigation into election fraud. So there is a lot of investment here in this issue. And I think that like just explaining a little bit more and letting them behind the scenes, so to speak, would be interesting to them, right? When they're reading a fact check, it's not just a dismissal, it's like a full investigation, even if the conclusion is like this didn't happen, right? That's always less exciting than this did sometimes.
Oh, go ahead.
Did you encounter like pushback from the people you interview in terms of the things you were like citing or hyperlinking to? Because I feel that in our reporting, probably we're all doing, when we write story, we can say there's been like 10 audits on the election in this county, and they all show that there's no evidence, and we can link to all the reports, but it's still a government entity.
Right.
And a reporter telling you to like look at this government agency. Did you receive any pushback on that, or?
Yeah, so in the interviews, we were just asking questions, so we were not engaging in like a back and forth in that sense, where we were showing them, like trying to debunk some of the claims that they were making. But what is interesting is, this was not every single person, obviously, but some people were actually saying, like, I don't trust the news media, so where do I go for information? I go to the .gov websites. So trying to circumvent like the news media's filter, so to speak, what they would say, and get to the first hand sources. So it's going to be different for every like individual, obviously. That was a consistent theme, that we cannot put every single person that believes in election fraud into like one big bucket and say that it's going to work for all of them. But I wouldn't say that you would receive like uniform pushback from people in this group by just linking to government websites and government reports.
But I do think, Sergio, you highlight a really important point that is intertwined with the misinformation problem, is that there's not only a lack of trust in the news media, there's a lack of trust in government. There's a lack of trust in everything, in society, you know. So you're right in the sense that there's some people who, if they on their own go to a government website, they trust it. But if it's going through KUT's filter, they're like, no, they must have, you know, put some voodoo on it or something. So yeah, I mean, there is. And then there's you know, there is low trust in government. And we see that with COVID-19. I mean, people don't trust the government about things, which is all intertwined with that. You know, so it's not a perfect solution to provide government websites, but probably better than no solution at all. You know, better than not. The other thing I wanted to talk about in regard to this question is, and this is some research we did that didn't immediately, it wasn't directly about the election, but it kind of resonates with what it was, is that we did both focus groups using broadcast stories, and we did focus groups with print stories. And what we did is we showed people different versions of the stories and had them talk about them. And one of the things that was really interesting about it was that people misinterpreted sort of what I would see sort of like journalists doing journalism as a sinister motive. So, and they saw it as biased. So for example, there was a story about Wells Fargo, you know, them ripping people off, and we showed them a story about that, and it was a follow-up story. And it was clearly a follow-up story. Like, I could look at it, you could look at it, we all knew it was a follow-up story. They looked at it and said, oh, the Wall Street Journal is in cahoots with Wells Fargo because they didn't do a big investigation. They just reported a press release from Wells Fargo, which they did, but that's because it was a follow-up story, right? But they didn't get that it was a follow-up story. Like, they didn't know that. So one takeaway we had from that was, you know, and this came up in our small group before the lunch, is to be really redundant and overt about this. Like, we wrote about this before and linked to it, or even have a note that's like, we've written about this before, so that, I mean, it seems obvious and it almost feels like you're breaking a rule by keep repeating yourself, but they were confused by that. Another example that came up with the broadcast story is there was a police chief, and this was, we were teamed up with a TV station in Cincinnati. Police chief in Cincinnati got arrested for DWI. And one of the stories we showed them was the arrest of this police chief. And the people in the focus group, who must drink a lot, got very upset because they were like, why are they doing a story about DWI? That seems very biased. They were worried that they were going to be on the news if they got a DWI. And then, you know, we showed them another version of the story where the TV station explained that the reason they were doing this story about the arrest was because it's the police chief, right? And that seems abundantly obvious to, like, all of us in this room, but they didn't get that. They were just like, why are they picking on this police chief? Well, oh my God, am I going to be on the news for DWI? That terrible TV station. But once it was explained to them, they were like, oh, well, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, the police chief should be held to a higher standard than me. And I bring that example up because I think it resonates with the election coverage too. It's like there's all this stuff we learn as journalists that are so obvious to us, and they're not obvious to the public. and you do them, and the public's like, whoa, you're doing something to distort the truth. Like even things as simple as, including multiple voices in a story, right? People sometimes saw that as biased because, well, why do they have this person? And they understood you're supposed to have multiple sides, but they also felt like it was still prioritizing a side if someone they disagreed with was in it. So one of the things we tested out experimentally, which had some limited success, it's not overwhelming, it's not a cure, but it's what we call a transparency box, where you'd run a box with the story, or you could say this orally if it was broadcast, that you just explain. Like with the police chief example, we did a version where they just explained, we're doing the story about the police chief because, he's the top law enforcement official in the city and is held to a higher standard. So it just gave people sort of a reason and sort of to hang their hat on. And that might be something that easily could translate to especially that pre-bunking election coverage, where it's like you're explaining, here's the process of what happens with absentee ballots being counted. And we're explaining this because this is going to become an issue on election night. And so it doesn't seem like you're on one side of the issue or the other.
What kinds of concerns did people in your research express about the 2020 election? And how can journalists try to address these issues in future election coverage?
I think that y'all have this one down for everything that I've already heard. It was mail-in ballots. It was mail-in ballots, mail-in ballots, mail-in ballots. That they kind of interpreted that because it was something that we, just used more in this election, right, than other elections in the past for safety reasons. And that it was something that they were even less familiar with, right, than just the traditional in-person voting process. So I think that they were inherently suspicious of that going into it. And I think that just opened them up to believe a lot of the other anecdotes that they heard. So I think really explaining that, like y'all have said, before the election goes in, so they know a little bit more about what to expect, that they're armed with knowledge pre-hand. So when they hear these rumors in their community, it doesn't stick as much.
And one thing that came out a lot in the interviews that I was involved with was just how people are portrayed in the stories. So this could be election stories or any stories, where they had this perception, and there's probably some evidence of this perception, that the news media tends to, when they quote somebody in a story, it's sort of a more stereotypical extreme version of whatever. So like the example one person said to us is, if you're talking about people who don't believe, who believe that there's voter fraud, for example, it is a stereotype of that person. So as this person said, we're not all driving a pickup truck with a Confederate flag off the back of our truck. And what the concern was, that even within certain communities, you quote people or you show people who are interesting, right? And those are more extreme voices. And they're more extreme voices, so they're more interesting, but then that could make other people not believe what you're doing, because you feel like it's just perpetuating the stereotype of people like me are always portrayed in a negative way. And I mean, I think we all feel that way, right? There's any group you're part of, you don't want the stereotype of that group portrayed. But that was very pronounced among the conservatives that we interviewed, that they felt like they became a caricature in the news a lot, and that there were more moderate voices that maybe were not included because they're not as entertaining. Like the soundbite from the crazier person is more entertaining than the soundbite from the person who might have a different political view but isn't as unhinged. So that's just something to think about. Go ahead.
We've seen a rise in, kind of more political extremism, but also violence against media too, as well as political figures. In the interviews that you were doing, did you guys experience any animosity toward media professionals or other groups or individuals? I mean, like the recent thing that happened in Las Vegas, for example, and we've seen some other stuff as well. So I was just curious, because the work I do puts me directly in contact with a lot of people in this role.
I mean, I will say in our interviews, we didn't, but what we did encounter is people being very reluctant to talk to journalists. You know, I mean, this project that I was involved in, we teamed up with 27 newsrooms, and then the newsrooms recruited people in their own communities through a survey that we created to be interviewed. But we did it that way, so it was like the journalists in that community recruiting people in their community to build trust. But even with that, a lot of people were very reluctant to talk. Even though it was, you know, we didn't use their names, we knew their names, but it was confidential. And the other thing I would say was there was a few people who actually like reached out to me first and like had to have like a little conversation with me first to make sure I was like, I guess, okay. And I presume I passed, whatever, I'm not sure. You know, because I think they were worried. So it wasn't violence. They didn't talk about violence. Overwhelmingly, they really liked their local news organizations. And, you know, it was sort of a love-hate relationship. They really hated national media, but local, they were like, yeah, we care about them, but we also are sort of mad at them sometimes, you know. But they certainly liked y'all much better than the national media. So there's that, yeah.
One way you can kind of combat that mistrust and try to fight against it, and like it's just like change that arcane method of like competition, like collaborate. So you know, like we definitely collaborate heavily with the community, but we also collaborate with our media partners as well. And so like what can happen, and we've seen it happen in Detroit, is like a local organization might have more of that community trust by partnering with a larger, more known organization. That larger organization gets some of that trust, and you're being like, oh, this is a article co-published. You know, we have our followers, they have theirs, and vice versa too. Like, who is Outlier? I never heard of Outlier, but I know Free Press. You know what I mean? And it just gives credibility to each other. And then like, I mean, we meet every month with our media partners, and we have editors meetings, and it's like, for some of them, it's very, you know, like I'm used to guarding my story with all my heart, but it's like, no, we're telling each other what we're working on, and we're looking at, okay, well, we're working on the same story. Well, why don't you publish it from this angle, and I'll publish it from this angle, and you drop yours on Tuesday, and I'll drop mine on Thursday. And I mean, if the goal is really, like my friend behind her says, like democracy, and we think about what is the news, what are we doing, then that can kind of bring you out of that. It just kind of becomes natural, you know what I mean, to that competition, but like try to get that out of here and collaborate more.
Yeah, I love that suggestion. And it's interesting because it also brought up something that people did tell us during the focus groups was, and this is going to shock everybody, but they really kind of hated the competition. They felt like, you know, they didn't like when TV stations were like, you know, we have this first. They were like, we don't care. We don't care if you have it first. Now, I mean, we care. I mean, you know, I know, you know what I mean? Like, I remember when we first moved online and my editor was like, we're going to put stuff online. And you were like, what? What are we doing? You know, we're giving it to the other competition. But I think the public really doesn't get that as much. I mean, like, or they see it as sort of infighting. So I love that kind of cooperation idea. It sounds really great.
You're like, you know, you do kind of want that, and we ask, we're like, hey, just, you know, quote us, hyperlink us,
Right.
Send us
Right.
back. Both of these websites are getting clicked on. You
Right.
know what I mean?
Exactly.
Like,
Yeah.
we can work together.
Yeah.
And I think that can apply to election coverage too, because a huge source of confusion for people
Was like, oh, it doesn't work that way in my state, even if they understood like mail-in ballot regulations for their own state, for example. They were like, oh, that's not happening the same way in Pennsylvania or Wisconsin, and therefore there must be something nefarious going on here. So like linking to each other's reporting, right? Like I think even if you're not directly collaborating on a story.
So one last question before we open it up to everyone for Q&A. What did you
is fine.
find?
Yeah.
I just wanted to let you know we are coming around to Q&A. What did you find in your research that you didn't expect?
Yeah, I think that my main first impression was that because belief in election fraud seemed so extraordinary, right? Like the belief in widespread election fraud And so consequential that people who said that they believe this must do so really strongly, right? And must be unpersuadable if they're willing to say something that like grandiose. And I found that that like really wasn't the case. There were of course some people that were on the fringe edge, but I think most people were just like struggling to understand the voting process and really wanted to. So I think that that was interesting, kind of complicating the picture, like going back to the portrayal of conservatives in the media too, not just saying that the people who believe this are all January 6th protesters and rioters, and they think that that was a great event. And so I think that was one. And then another thing that was surprising was when we asked people where they were learning about election fraud. Some people did say that they saw it on their local news. And I would take that with a grain of salt because we're not the best at saying or attributing like where we first heard about information. But then also I think that there is a level of like misinterpretation. Like I don't think that there were a lot of local news stations saying that this was definitely happening. But if they reported on like a mishandling or an incident, right, that was still newsworthy, but maybe that person didn't see the follow-up, or they were just watching the video and misinterpreted the video, right? So I think really knowing that people use that to like build their picture of election fraud, I think is important in how we approach those kinds of stories, or y'all.
And I'll just add two things. One thing that I think is important about that whole local national trust thing was that we did find that people do trust their local poll workers. They just don't trust the ones in other states as much. So it's like, it's that weird phenomenon that it's like, yeah, I trust my local paper. I take my local station. I trust my local poll workers. But those other people are doing things wrong. So that's an opportunity, because they do, especially in smaller community, they trust that community more. The other thing I would bring up is just a lot of what we found about context in stories in general. On the one hand, people want more context in stories. On the other hand, they think context is having an agenda and bias. So it's like, a tricky, like, lane to sort of go through. But one suggestion that came from our transparency box idea is if you actually explain that you're giving the context, right? Here's the background for this story versus it being in there, right? Like, when you're writing a story, and I'm thinking more print because I was a print person, but this also happens in broadcast, right? You have that paragraph that you always have, but the public doesn't always see that as the context. They see it as, well, this journalist is just throwing this thing in for God knows what reason. I mean, that's what people really were saying to us. And so maybe there's a way to highlight it, like in a separate way that's like, here's why we're providing this background, so that there's not that speculation that there's some sinister motive about it. And now we'd love, go ahead.
So kind of on that point you just made then, because I was going to ask about, y'all were saying like the type of statement like there was no widespread evidence of election fraud like doesn't really resonate, but like how do you get to that quickly enough without having to reinvent the wheel every time? Is that sort of like the context box of like you can maybe like explain like a little bit more but still be brief enough for it to be a box, but to put it in there, put that
yeah, I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense, and I think it is a problem. And the box, the only magic of the box is, I think, when people skim, they look at the box. I mean, because one thing we did test with the boxes, one set of our boxes were just gray, and nobody read them, and then we made them like blue, and people read them. I mean, so,
Put them at the bottom
right,
of the page,
yeah, right.
page, yeah.
Yeah, so I think something like that, we didn't specifically test that, but that would be in accordance with what we found. Let's see. Go ahead. And then,
Gina, you said there were, you identified kind of 3 groups of people. What were those groups? It was people who were persuadable.
well,
and then
yeah, I mean,
kind of in the
certainly
middle, or-
we found when we interviewed the conservatives, I'm not sure, I don't want to say that for the people that she was involved with the interview, but in the conservatives, there was a large swath of them who really were, I would say, persuadable. They weren't, not everybody who's conservative is like a MAGA conservative, right? And then, so there was a large group of them, that were open to hearing information. They hadn't had their mind made up. They really were more confused than misinformed. And then I think there was people who are like, absolutely, so maybe there's only two groups, but the real absolutely, nothing you say is probably going to persuade them. And it seems like you almost spend less time with that, right? Like you can't fix that problem. But by and large, most of the people I feel like we interviewed were, they were not as entrenched in their beliefs as that they would be unpersuadable to saying, hey, this is misinformation. A lot of it was confusion or misunderstanding, like how a news story comes about, and assuming sort of like some sinister motive of how it comes about, right? It's almost like people always think it's a conspiracy when it's usually like a mistake. Like, why did this story not get covered? Because someone called in sick and it just didn't get covered, right? Like that's usually the reason. I think she was next, and then you.
Yeah, I was just wondering, did you say that transparency box is in the middle of the page or the bottom of the page?
Very preliminary, info on that. We were, she was saying we did multiple studies on transparency boxes, and some worked well and some didn't. So we were trying to put them next to each other and figure out what were the components here that may have caused difference. And one of them was the color of the box. And then one of them was the position on the page. If we asked people, did you see this box, on the news article you just read, after they read it, they were more likely to say they noticed it in the middle of the page versus at the very bottom.
Right, probably because they didn't scroll all the way down, we theorize, but yeah. Go ahead, you, and then you.
So no election is perfect, and mistakes happen, and sometimes illegal things happen. We didn't have 10,000 dead voters in Georgia, but we had 4. Like the widow who sends in her husband's ballot because she knows how he was going to vote, and she didn't realize it was illegal. And yes, there were 200 ballots that were accidentally counted twice. What I'm hearing you say is voters don't do nuance very well.
Yeah.
And so, how do you handle situations like that where there were real problems, yet the election still wasn't stolen?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think you're probably better in saying exactly what you said. I think you do have to say it, because if you don't say it, then people are gonna be like, why didn't they say it, right? There were isolated incidents, but it's not widespread fraud. But you're right, it does still have the potential then for people to say, see, there is fraud, and it's 4 cases, and not understand the context. It's like the ad we saw yesterday, right, where they said, oh, he got $2 million in funding, which sounds like a lot of money to the average person, but isn't relative to other politicians, right? For voter fraud, one could argue, well, there should be none, right? So I think our research would suggest you'd still want to say it, but make it very, very, very clear this is really minor, and that this always happens. That historically we've always had a few isolated incidents. So it doesn't seem like it's just this year, because I do think that was part of the issue too. People were just like, I never heard about this before, but it happened, it happened every election. It's just we didn't talk about it every election. Go ahead.
One of the things that we've been discussing is media partnerships, where 2 news organizations combine into writing a story together to give an added, this isn't just one news organization saying election deniers, blah, blah, blah. Is that something that you guys have looked into at all or have any thoughts on? Two outlets working together on one story about it versus, right, well, we're just going to publish this.
Right. We haven't directly looked at that, and I think it's a good question, though. It seems to me that it would enhance trust. That would be my hypothesis, right? Because they have 2 different audience, and you're bolstering it, and it's also you're getting 2 voices saying the same thing. Talia, did you have something you wanted to add?
We've done is we were looking at fact checks if you included multiple sources were part of this, and a lot of people didn't even notice that happened. So I think like you have to think about how visible this is going
Yeah.
back to what you guys were saying about that trust box. I saw a hand up here up for a while, so I just wanted to call it out.
Caroline, you mentioned the mail-in ballots being a big issue and a possible solution of doing the stories beforehand, right? We did in the last couple elections, and I think it gets to the issue of just how many people are or are not watching the news, and then of those people, how many have the 4 options, and then of those people, maybe we ran that story at 6 and they were watching at
Right.
5. And so is there anything in your research or in conversations that would give us a pathway to still make that impact and get to the viewer, get to the voter?
Yeah, I think that that's a difficult line to walk. I think it was about, out of the people that we interviewed, it was about a fourth that said that they watched their local news or read their local news regularly. So that's still like a good portion, more than I would have expected going into it. But I don't necessarily have insight from this study about how to get eyeballs where they need to be, right? Other than what might be impossible, which is just run it more. Don't just run it at 6, right? Get it in front of more people.
Yeah, redundancy. And that's uncomfortable, but yeah, that's probably the only answer. Go ahead.
As journalists, could we have done a better job? I know he said they would do stories about how the election was going to be run a little differently. It got very chaotic with COVID and election laws being changed at the last minute to accommodate COVID. Could we have done a better job of pre-bunking, I guess, what we knew was going to come when people see ballots all arriving at one time, just because of the way they're being collected like they've never been collected before. And so people look at that and they think, oh my God, this election is being stolen. People are bringing in these manufactured ballots. And as we all know, a lie can get halfway around the world before the truth can get its pants on. And that is true in this case, where people just saw these visuals of ballots showing up in the middle of the night, and they assume, okay, the election was stolen. Could we have done a better job of explaining to people, hey, on election night, the results are going to come in a little differently than you've ever seen them before?
I mean, I think, in retrospect, probably, but on the other hand, I think some of the things that happen on election night just normally happen on election night. They're just not visible. Right? I remember covering elections and waiting, in the pre-internet days and having to get vote totals from some clerk's house in the middle of nowhere, and waiting for her to get home and telling her husband, you have to wake her up because we need to know, and I don't, that's not visible to the public, and it was really visible this election.
What was visible, were the big chunks of votes coming
Right.
in all at once.
All at once.
And I know, like you said, in Georgia, there were apparently dead people voting. Four. But and there may have been some other anomalies. We had the Al Franken and Norm Coleman race in 2008 was decided by 312 votes out of a few million. So every vote does count. Now that's very rare, but in Minnesota, we're very attuned to, if there's a few hundred votes here or there that came in some squirrely fashion, people go, okay, the election might have been stolen. So, you got to be very careful how you report all of this.
Yeah, certainly if we could do a do-over, I would say yes, but I don't think any of us could have anticipated how bad things were. You know what I mean? I think if we did the whole thing over, yeah, you'd want to pre-bunk. But I also think some of the things that were happening on election night, there are absentee ballots that get brought in. There are late vote totals that get brought in bags. And people just never knew that happened, and we never had any reason to report that it happened because nobody cared, right? So I think it's both. I would probably be overtly, but, to the point before, you don't know that people are going to watch every story or read every story about it. So, it's not, even if you do everything right, I guess is what I'm saying, there's still people who will not believe.
Well, I want to, thinking about that generally, as I think back, I remember the stations that were trying to explain these things were explaining it themselves. I don't remember seeing a lot of stations get the governor or an election official to explain why that happened, right up front. where I wonder if that could have helped, because it
It
was
could.
a
Maybe they
different
trust that
voice where
person.
they might trust because of their knowledge.
Yeah.
I think looking to 2022 and 2024, we have every reason to have foresight now. Like those things can be already in the bag in terms of putting together. What do you expect to see? Why might you see a jump in the vote returns halfway through the night? This is how it works. Several people have mentioned explainers throughout our time together, and I think the time is now to prepare the explainer. They're going to need that on election night.
And for those of us who did that before the 2020 election, like maybe we can just really repurpose a lot of the stuff and not reinvent the wheel. I'm thinking back, it's like I feel like a lot of us collectively did that work, and it was just maybe we weren't doing it as urgently.
And maybe it's like the moment when you're doing it, is it the moment when the tension is there, and then what are you doing to like pummel that out during the moment when the public really needs it?
Go ahead.
I was wondering, in your research, was there a control group where you threw something that everyone did believe? For instance, like right now, I've never heard anyone argue that there's not an affordable housing crisis. Everyone's seeing rents are increasing, home prices are really high. Was there a control group? So anyone in your research that said, "Oh yeah, we do agree with that the media said"?
No, that's interesting. I mean, one thing I would say, these were interviews, so like a control group that you're talking about is more like when you do an experiment. However, I understand what you mean. You know, I don't think we specifically asked people about what they agree on. And that's a good point. I do think there's, you know, most of it was like their perceptions of the media and their perceptions of election, which they didn't. But yeah, I mean, I definitely think that would be true. I think we all would kind of agree, like inflation's high, right? Like everybody agrees with that, right? Gas prices are high. You know, you might disagree on why that is or whose fault it is, but you might agree on that. Yeah. No, that's a good question, which we didn't directly ask them. Yeah. Go ahead.
You talked about how the simple misunderstanding of how a lead can shift that easily or at certain points. Did you find, or did anyone talk about the calling of races? I always wonder kind of what that impact is, because I think that's something that few people understand how that happens. Because I know, family is the greatest feedback. I hear from family members all the time, well, how do they know all the votes aren't counted? Right. Did that come up?
Did that come up?
Yeah, this is totally anecdotal, almost not the majority of people in the study, but one thing that I found surprising is people turned against Fox News, like the most conservative people in this study were very critical of Fox News calling, I forget which state it was, Arizona, yeah, I'm talking to the room that knows. But just very, very critical of that and saying like, oh, I don't watch Fox News anymore after the 2020 election. So definitely confused about like, why are you, there is confusion around that, yes.
More confusion of the process than that's not what I expected?
Yeah, I would think so.
I also think one thing that came up with ours was that they did not understand that when the TV news is calling an election, they're not officially calling the election. Like that they were just like looking at actual data to call it. It wasn't like they're just like sitting around being like, well, we decided. Like there seemed to be some confusion about that. Like, well, why do they get to call it? And it's like, well, they're not calling it based on nothing. They're calling it based on vote totals and the likelihood that the other candidate could win. Like there's a point of no return, which they didn't really understand. We're not a super math literate country. So, I think that might be something that could be explained in a pre-bunking explainer story, right? Like it's not the media just deciding, here's the moment where we're calling it. Like there is a equation you in your head say, when we get to this point, we call it,
Really, it's more of a projection than
Exactly,
actual, it's not a final result.
And right.
We always have to remind people about that. We do a lot of polling in our races, and people saw our poll the other day, and they think, oh, so you predict so-and-so is going to win. We go, no, on September 5th, so-and-so is ahead.
Right.
Doesn't mean he's going to win on November 8th.
Right. And there's confusion about that. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm just thinking off the top of my head. I have no proof whatsoever but my own evidence. But, is it David? I don't know. But it said, like, you know, maybe rather than having the news media or anchor or whatever, like, explain this thing, they could have the governor explain how this works. And I'm instantly thinking, hell no, I'm not gonna, I'm gonna believe him even less. I don't believe neither one of y'all. So maybe there's room for, like, academia, though, right? And so totally, completely not journalism example, but similar in the community, like urban farmers, specifically Black urban farmers, like, don't trust the government. So USDA or whatever, like, trying to roll out all these programs to, you know, help offset some of the things that went on in the past. And, you know, sending whatever they send to us, I'm a farmer, whatever they send to us, like, no, I'm not really going to do that. Oh, it's got a USDA stamp on it. I don't trust you. But then when it comes to me through MSU, Michigan State University, I'm trusting them. And they're kind of like the go-between, you know what I mean? So they're getting the answers, research, whatever the government wanted from me, they're getting that. But they're, you know what I mean? So I'm just wondering, like, maybe Gina Masullo is on the news explaining how this.
I mean,
you know
he could be. I mean, I know, like, Talia actually, it was part of one of the decision desks for the election, and for that very reason, I will say, people kind of hate us too. I mean, I wish they'd listen to us, but sometimes, you know, especially here in Texas, I don't know that can be like an academic.
Why do people not trust academic institutions, though?
I don't know.
I mean, I feel like I'm just a big nerd, so I do, but I wonder why people don't.
Well, I think we're in pretty good shape because people don't trust journalists, politicians, scientists, or academics.
Yeah.
So we're in pretty good shape, I think.
Yeah.
But if you're an NFL quarterback, we believe anything.
I mean, and I'm one of them. I count my money out the ATM. You better believe it. Like, I don't trust anything.
I think if we have time for one more question, if anyone else has anything to wrap up.
One thing, this might be a funky question, but, you know, we think in our newsroom a lot about how, like, you know, we're long form investigative, so there are things that we just ignore if we don't put the resources on it. And, you know, the case of where there's maybe 3 dead voters, we're not going to put the resources to report on that because it might amplify it. And we're sort of prioritizing in some way the idea that in our effort to sort of like protect democracy, that we are prioritizing like how could the state allow the most eligible voters to vote or encourage the most eligible voters to vote. I'm wondering if like in your interviews or your research, like the idea that people who are eligible should be able to vote, that voting is more of a right than a privilege ever came up, because otherwise like people are going to hear that 3 dead voters voted and say like the whole system is flawed because that should never happen. But like how are some of those conservative voters balancing the value in increasing access to the polls, I guess?
Yeah, so that was something that came up in a smaller number of people that we interviewed, and I mean smaller than just the overall mail-in vote concern, was kind of a more traditional concern that I'm used to hearing before 2020, right? Which was like, oh, we need one person, one vote, like we need an ID to vote at the polls, like that was like the first step, and now they're trying to do mail-in voting, so they're just making the process more and more lawless, right? And so I think that like there is that basis starting off in conservative minds, at least the people that ultimately did end up believing that the election was fraudulent, that it's a pre-existing concern that the voting system was under attack or more open for manipulation, right? And that existed before 2020. So I was not hearing that in the more expansive access to voting rights as like, a fundamental right versus a privilege from those voters.
No, go ahead.
Because we try to tell these stories of like, for instance, when our Supreme Court basically just said that drop boxes are now all illegal in Wisconsin after they've been in place for years. And so we're telling the stories of like, people with disabilities who might not be able to vote as easily, and there's this question about whether someone could mail a ballot for somewhere else, like physically stick in the mail. So like talking about like this is the implication if this goes forward. But would those, is it your impression that those types of stories, I mean, while they might amplify the voices of people being affected, and we want to do that, like they might not really resonate with some of these people, that these people, like, that it's okay to just kind of cut them out of the system, and show people that not everyone has the same experience voting with ease that you, conservative voter, might have.
So I wouldn't like speak with authority on that because I wasn't, presenting them with those kinds of stories. But at least in the people that I talked to that mentioned that, they weren't so much saying like, I don't want people to vote, I just want the system to be secure. And they would say like, of course we need exceptions for people who are in our military, who are like voting overseas, or people who are too old like to get to the polls. Like they were talking about the nursing home stuff, that was obviously a problem in their eyes too. But that there does need to be an avenue for them. They just wanted it to be like very regulated, very transparent. So my guess would not be that that kind of story would have at least any adverse effect, and it could have a positive effect.
And the other thing too is, and I think this goes back to the process stories we were talking about earlier, is I think that people understand how many safeguards are already in place. Like I think about Texas, like both my kids were away at college and had to get absentee ballots to vote. Getting an absentee ballot in Texas, I mean, it is a complicated, lengthy, confusing process that if you make one little mistake, you don't get it. So it is not easy. But I don't think sometimes the people who are pushing up against that think that it's an all or nothing. It's like either we just do nothing or there's restrictions, and they don't realize that there already is a lot of restrictions. Like it's not a free-for-all. We're really not a free-for-all.
Did you ask if any of them voted by mail?
Yes, and they did.
Some did.
There's a little irony there.
Well, that's the other thing. They were like, oh, I want to be able to, I don't know if my like ballot like made it to like where it was supposed to be. And there are, I know some states do this, like allow you to track your ballot, so to speak. So if people are concerned about that in your community, and they are, might be worth a link.